You're listening to a podcast from 702 and Cape Talk.
702 and Cape Talk.
The Naked Scientist.
You can, of course, give us a call with your questions about the world around you on 021-446-0567 and 011-883-0702. You can also drop us an SMS on 31567 and 31702. Chris, good morning.
Good morning.
Yeah, so this week, apparently scientists announcing that something in the guts of worms and flies and mice is slowing down the aging process.
Yes, and let's hope this works in humans as well, because the motivation for Daniel Kalman, who's a researcher at Emory University's work, is that in the next 40 years or so, the number of extremely old people living in the majority of countries around the world is set to rise by 350-fold. Mm-hmm. And of course, older people are less mobile, they're less independent, and if we can make people age better, the health burden of trying to look after a very, very considerably aging population could be reduced. So they're looking at how to make people not live longer, but live healthier for longer, so people remain more healthy and they can do more and they need less health input. And they started off looking at tiny worms because although these worms C. elegans, are microscopic, their biochemistry and many of the systems in their bodies are exactly the same as ours. So if you study a very, very rapidly growing worm that ages fast, then it tells you something about how we age, and that might tell us how, if we can cure these worms, how we can cure humans. So what they did was to feed these worms with bacteria, so they got bugs in their guts that either did or didn't make chemicals called indoles. These are very common chemicals secreted by bacteria, but their worms either had bacteria that could make these or they had bacteria that couldn't. The worms that had bacteria that could make these indoles aged much better than worms that didn't. Normally, these worms stop reproducing by 5 days of age, and by about 15 days of age, they become moribund and they can barely move. The tiny worms in their experiments with the indoles, they could actually keep moving like a fit young worm well into their 20 days. So they were aging much better. And they then repeated the experiments in flies, which are a bit bigger and a bit more complicated, but again, quite similar to how our own bodies work. Same story. And then they tried this in mice, and they got very, very old-aged mice that were behaving as though they were much, much younger. So as they say in their paper in the journal PNAS this week, that perhaps we could use this sort of strategy as one way to keep people healthier into their old age, and it suggests that the bugs that live in our guts have a strong influence on how well we age. And so perhaps probiotics, manipulations of gut bugs, or eating the right sorts of diets to maintain the right sorts of bacteria in the gut will play a very important role in helping us to age healthily.
How much of a role does mobility play in aging a lot healthier? Because we hear that we're not moving as much as we should. We're sitting a lot more, which is very bad for our health. And I imagine with all of these animals, they move a whole lot more than, say, the average person. So do we know how much of a role mobility is playing in how we're aging?
Yeah, well, exercise, as many people say, if you could make a pill which is half as good for your health as exercise and mobility is, then it would be a blockbuster. There's no drug that comes even close to the physical benefits of modest exercise. And so it looks like a sort of catch-22 situation, this, because you end up with an animal that ages less well, so it becomes less mobile and takes less exercise, and that then makes things worse because you're more likely to gain weight, you're more likely to have other problems of being sedentary, and that in turn feeds back and makes all the initial problems worse. So you're quite right to point the finger at this. If you maintain your level of activity, you are healthier all round, and that's part and parcel of what they're saying with this piece of research, that if you can keep active, then actually you age better in a range of different ways.
Masinyan Tito asking, please ask the Naked Scientist, what is the role of flies and mosquitoes in our ecosystem? Can we eliminate them completely and live in peace? That's a question on Twitter.
Yeah, I mean, it's a common one, this thing. We've got all these horrible things like mosquitoes that want to give us diseases. Mosquitoes are the most dangerous animal on Earth because they convey all kinds of things like malaria, like dengue, and therefore couldn't we just get rid of them? The answer is not really, because they're an important part of nature's tapestry. There are thousands of different species of mosquito all over the world, so that's a big challenge. And also, the way that nature works is that every animal fits into a gap in the ecosystem. And if you don't have an animal in that gap, then eventually one will crop up that fills that gap. So if we removed mosquitoes, A, we're removing a food source for something, and B, we're creating a gap which actually something else will just step into. So it's not a solution just to keep getting rid of things that are inconvenient for humans. We have to learn to live alongside them better. Some of that strategy might include not building big towns, cities and settlements and then dumping all our rubbish outside those towns, cities and settlements where we encourage mosquitoes to move in. So better stewardship of the environment is part of it. There are other techniques that people are exploring as well, like obviously better drugs to control these diseases, because a lot of them are carried only by humans. So if you stop humans carrying the disease, there's nothing to give to the mosquito, and that solves part of the problem, because people can put up with a few mosquito bites, but they don't want to put up with malaria. And then there are more radical solutions. People are now exploring genetic solutions to this, something called a gene drive. And the idea of these techniques is that you could get genes into mosquitoes that might make it impossible for them to carry certain diseases, and the genes propagate through the population, leaving the mosquitoes alive but taking away their ability to make us unwell. So there's a whole raft of ways and means that people are exploring to do this, but we couldn't just remove these animals, and they have evolved because there was an opportunity in the environment for them to evolve, and they are a rich part of nature. They feed things, so we have to be very cautious what we change, because it's a bit like a spider web, lots of different strands, and if you cut a few, the whole thing goes out of shape. So we manipulate the environment at our peril.
We've got Karabo in Pretoria. Here's a question about the universe. Karabo, good morning.
Good morning. Chris, right? Is my line okay?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead, Karabo.
All right. I read an article saying that the universe will end in 1 million years. So I started to make an assumption that said, if the universe is going to end in 1 million years, how many times has it ended? And which iteration are we in of the universe? Have they calculated that yet?
Yeah, we don't think the universe is going to end in 1 million years. Not quite. The universe is already 13.8 billion years old, so we're measuring the lifetime of the universe in billions, not millions. Our own sun, which is illuminating the earth and giving us heat and light and warmth and keeping us alive, that's about 4.5, 5 billion years old, and has, judged on how fast it's burning and how much fuel it's still got in it, has got another 5 billion years or so to run. And the universe at the moment is getting bigger. So we don't think the universe is going to end anytime soon. We don't think our own sun in our solar system, in our galaxy, in our part of the cosmic neighbourhood is going to end anytime soon. But to return to your final question, which is, well, how many times has this happened in the past? We don't know. We don't know if the universe that we're in is the only universe. There are other theories in physics. They're impossible to test at the moment, but people are looking at it, which point towards perhaps there are many universes, the so-called parallel universe theory. Perhaps we're in one, but there are many, many universes that have popped in and out of existence, and we happen to be in this one because this is where the rules of physics work for us. The answer is we just don't know.
Okay. Bongani in Soweto has a question. Oh, Bongani, let's try to get you on a better line. Cliff in Randburg, good morning.
Hello, morning.
Yes,
morning, Chris.
Hi, Cliff.
Hello.
Yes, go ahead, Cliff, with your question.
Yeah, Chris, I've got a question. You know, sometimes we buy eggs at the supermarket and it's got a double yolk. I'm sure you've experienced that, have you? Now,
Yes,
I want
have,
to know, if that egg hatches, do we get a twin chick, or one chick with, or a chick with one head and two bodies, or one chick with two heads and one body?
Okay, now the reason that they have two yolks, the yolk is a big collection of cholesterol and fat and energy, and inside the egg, but associated with that yolk, is an embryo. And when the egg is fertilized, the embryo is what turns into the chick, and it feeds off of the yolk. You'll only get two chicks in an egg if there are two embryos, the stem cells, or the egg cell that then gets fertilized and turns into the stem cells that will produce the chick. It's possible that the yolk can divide into two and only have one embryo attached to it, so you'd still get one chick, it's just connected to two yolks. But if there were two embryos inside the egg, you could get two chicks. I'm not sure how often that happens.
And a question about crossbreeding. Why don't animals crossbreed? So why do we never see a lion crossbred with a leopard? Is a question we got via SMS as well. Why is that?
Well, part of this comes down to species differences. The definition of a species is a collection of animals that are fertile only with themselves. So if I have a species and I put it with a totally different group of animals, then that are a different species, the two animals could not breed and produce viable young. Now, there are some instances or exceptions here where if you have one species and it has a very close relative, which is nonetheless another species, but they're sufficiently close in evolutionary time that they are fertile in the sense that you could put one of one with one of the other species and you would get progeny. Those progeny are not themselves necessarily fertile. This happens quite a lot. So you'd end up with, it can happen, but it then breeds itself out of existence because any of the progeny can't themselves then have more progeny. So the reason this occurs is because with evolutionary time, you accumulate changes in your DNA which make a species have the specific characteristics that it does. And those changes in the DNA render the DNA of that animal incompatible, or that plant, incompatible with another species because there isn't the right lineup of genetic cards in the card deck to give you the right combination of cards that work in the right way to play a game of cards with. And that's why species are thought to be not cross-fertile in that way.
It is the Naked Scientist for this week. Chris in studio answering your questions on 021 446 0567 and 011 883 0702. You can also send us your questions via SMS. That's on 31702 and 31567.
702 and Cape Talk.
The Naked Scientist.
22 minutes after 10 o'clock, still joined in studio by the Naked Scientist, Chris Smith, and trying to answer some of your weird and wonderful questions about the world on 011 883 0702 and 021 446 0567. Joy in Krugersdorp, you have a question about fertility. Good morning.
Yes, good morning. That's right. When I'm in my 70s now. When I was having babies, we were advised to have them in our 30s, but not later because they could be a disability. But now women are having their babies quite safely in their 30s and even 40s.
Chris?
Is there a reason for that?
Right, okay. The reason for this is that fertility doesn't decline linearly with age. What I mean by that is if you take a graph of on the x-axis how old you are and on the y-axis how fertile you are, you can't draw a straight line going downwards which says that for every year you lose a little bit of your fertility or your fertility stays in a flat line until you are, say, 45 and then it goes away. That doesn't happen. The line is relatively flat for about the first 30 to 35 years of a lady's life. And then suddenly the fertility drops off very dramatically year on year after the age of 35. And this means that people are advised, if they want to have the best chances of having a baby and having a healthy baby, that having a baby by the age of about 30 or around the age of about 30 coincides with probably your best lifestyle factors. You've got training, probably got your best job prospects, you've probably got some money in the bank and a reasonable house, but you've also got the most of your fertility. If you go beyond the age of 35, that's not to say that you won't get pregnant. It might take you longer to become pregnant. You may also have a higher likelihood of not becoming pregnant or having other problems or genetic problems. And so what has happened in the more modern era is that the cost of living has risen enormously in many, many countries. The amount of training that people are having to go through before they reach a senior position that gives them stability at work has become quite long. And so people are tending to defer their having children until they're older. And that doesn't mean that people aren't having babies, but what it does mean is that more people are having more problems having babies. And this is something that many countries are very worried about because actually we're then seeing people who have to go through things like assisted conception and IVF to help them have the babies that they want. So the advice hasn't changed. It still remains that prior to the age of 35, you have your best prospects of having children. Doesn't mean you can't have children after that age, but you're more likely to have problems. And the reason we think this happens is that something physically basically changes in the ovary. And if you want to read the work of a lady called Francesca Duncan, who does work at Northwestern University in Chicago in America, she actually has found that the ovary gets stiffer. The tissue becomes physically stiffer as the ovary ages, and this, in turn, affects the way in which the new eggs are formed in the ovary for ovulation, because the environment is obviously less of a good nurturing environment to grow an egg, and that probably affects the way in which the viability of those eggs, thus accounting for why fertility changes with age.
We've got Hassi in Cape Town with a question. Good morning, Hassi.
Good morning. Good morning, Professor. When you pull the plug in a bath or in a basin, the water tends to leave in either a clockwise or anti-clockwise direction. Is there any truth in that it depends in which hemisphere you are, north or south?
Okay, this is both
I'll
grain of
listen
truth.
on the radio.
Thank you
This
very
is
much.
both a grain of truth but also a massive myth at the same time. Now, on the scale of a small bathtub or a sink or a lavatory in the average bathroom, then it is entirely down to local factors whether the water goes clockwise or anti-clockwise down the drain.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at the average bathtub, the taps are not in the middle. The taps are off to one side. So when you put the water into the bathtub or the sink, the water is already turning because it goes into the tub and it then hits the side and is deflected round in a circle. And water carries on circulating in the bathtub or whatever for a really long time after you put the water in. So not surprisingly, when you pull the plug out, the water already has some angular momentum, so it just accelerates and makes a whirlpool in that direction. That's not to say that there isn't a phenomenon called the Coriolis effect. The Earth is spinning, and because the Earth is spinning, there is angular momentum in bodies around the Earth's surface, which you can't just get rid of that. And so if you do the experiment really carefully, then there really is an effect. And if you want to read the papers, it was done in Australia in the 1950s, I think, by a guy called Trefethen, and it was done in the Northern Hemisphere in, I think it was either New York or Boston, by a chap called Shapiro, I think in the 60s or 70s. The way they did those experiments was to get a very big bath. It was literally 1 metre across, a circular bath with smooth edges and a very small hole right at the dead centre. They filled it up, let it settle for a long time after they filled it up to get rid of any natural movement of the water, and then they took out the cork and they watched, and there was movement in the southern hemisphere. It moved clockwise, and in the northern hemisphere it rotated anti-clockwise, and this is because of this so-called Coriolis effect. The Earth is moving, but you have to do that experiment incredibly carefully to elicit that effect, and in the average bathroom this is not the case. It is because the water was already turning when you put it into the bath or the sink or it went down the lavatory.
Bongani in Soweto, final question for this morning. Good morning.
Hi, Coach, how are you?
We're good, thank you, Bongani.
Good. Hi, Dr. Chris. I have a quick one. Is it possible to overcome your worst fear? And is fear a disorder? Thanks.
Thank you for that question, Bongani. Overcoming your worst
can we
fear?
surmount phobias? This is possible, and the reason that we have phobias, people develop irrational fears for a range of different reasons, but there is something which is called exposure therapy, or aversion, limited exposure aversion therapy, and what you do is to slowly expose a person to the thing that they are frightened of, within the realms that that's possible. And the idea is that you allow them to develop coping strategies so that in a series of graded exposures, so small amount, bit more, you slowly enable them to build up cognitive resilience so that you learn that instead of your fear realising that I'm frightened of this and I'm frightened of this because if I do this, this might happen, you learn that this doesn't happen, and you slowly gain confidence that actually it's not so frightening after all. And knowing that it isn't so bad means that you're sort of forewarned is forearmed. You know that you are okay in those circumstances, and so you can combat your fears to a certain extent. And this has been used very effectively to some people, but it doesn't work for everybody, and it depends on the circumstance, because it's possible to be frightened of some things, and you couldn't possibly expose some people to certain things they're frightened of because they wouldn't be feasible. But certainly you can use this kind of cognitive behavioural therapy to help people to develop better sort of emotional and psychological reserve so that they're better able to talk themselves down and not get themselves worked up about something, and that helps them to function better.
That's the Naked Scientist for this week. Chris, always a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. See you next time.